Greetings. This is a brief lecture on the chapter on socialization processes. I'm just going to hit a few of the main ideas and talk about some examples. I don't think you're going to find this chapter particularly challenging. It just really looks more in depth about how we go about integrating into a culture or into an organization. So sort of the individualized aspect of the different frameworks we've been looking at. And I think it will help you start to apply the frameworks a little bit more easily. So the first section is about what they call what the author calls a three-step socialization process: anticipatory, encounter, and metamorphosis. So anticipatory would typically be finding out about the organization, going through the interview process, maybe finding out about the company's reputation. So one thing I'd like you to think about is how much more complex or different is that now than perhaps the book goes into. So for me, when I'm looking at an organization, part of my anticipatory process, because I like to reduce the ambiguity as much as I can, is go to LinkedIn, see if I know anybody who works there, see if I know anybody who knows anybody who works there. Maybe send out a question on my Facebook page to see if anybody knows anybody who works there and wants to talk to me. I can take them to lunch. Definitely I'm going to go to Glassdoor and see what current and former employees, glassdoor.com if you're interested in it, have had to say. Austin in particularly is a super networked town. I think how easily you get jobs in this town is how well you know people. We don't like unknown quantities, I think, in Austin. And I think anybody who's moved here has sort of gone through that long dry spell before you get hired. We're also I would look at the company's marketing and its website and see if there's a match or a lack of match between how they present themselves and what their employees say about them or what Glassdoor says about them. So my vetting process is pretty complex, and I would think that for most people these days it is. If you are at all computer savvy, there are a lot more ways of doing the anticipatory stage actively than I think we have in the past. You know, it's not just like you do a phone interview and then you do an interview and you ask a few questions. There's a whole lot more data that we have access to and that most of us have gotten pretty savvy at accessing. So the next section is encounter. It's the experiences that we have when we come in. I think in class we've talked about how when you come into a new job, there's all sorts of conscious and unconscious observations we make to see how to fit into the culture, what the norms are, you know, if people talk on their cell phones, if they take lunches at their desk, all of these things are part of the encounter phase, in addition to any kind of training, questions that we may ask, but those are all heavily influenced by culture. So I look at this second phase, the encounter phase, after we've been hired, as very much based on trying to assimilate into the culture phase. And so one thing to think about is how much of this encounter phase is conscious, how much are we thinking about, and how much is unconscious, how much of it is things that we absorb. During the encounter phase, do we always avoid discomfort? So am I going to be worried that my boss thinks I don't know what I know, or don't know enough to do the position, you know, that maybe... Do I have to try and present the impression that I'm incredibly competent and ready to roll, or is it okay for me to ask lots of questions? That's really depends on my personality and my boss's personality and the culture of the organization. Knowing myself as I do, I will not be taking a job with an organization where it's not okay to ask questions, but I promise you I have learned that the hard way. So it's something to think about, what that encounter process is like. I also think that this is sort of a magnifying glass into culture in terms of what we're looking at theoretically right now. It's sort of the minutia of the culture and how the socialization process affects the culture. You know, and so there's a list of different types of encounters later in the chapter, which include overt and indirect inquiry, secondary sources, so asking a coworker instead of your boss about something, testing boundaries, disguising questions in casual conversation, and observation or surveillance. And so it's interesting to think about, which of those tactics you might use the most, and how much that's changed over time, and how much it's changed based on the organization that you're part of. And it might also be interesting to think about how much that might change from the beginning of your work with St. Edward's towards the end, because I promise you will become more conscious of the information that you take in and how you react to it. And so you may find yourself more overt and direct than you were when you went in. Who knows? No, I did. And then the third phase is metamorphosis. And so my question about that, this integration, this assimilation into the organization, when are we really insiders? Is it when we integrate into the mainstream culture and can reproduce the norms, like the scene that we watched in Parks and Recreation, where the guy sort of went, "Yay, I love this pony, he's so awesome." Well, so he's reproducing the norm, but obviously he doesn't feel like he's actually part of the team. So could metamorphosis be perhaps when we actually have a smaller subgroup to which we belong? It's like, it's one thing to be able to reproduce the norms of the culture, whether or not you actually buy into them. It's another thing to have a group of people you feel like you can kind of let down your metaphorical hair with. So I want to think about that metamorphosis phase in a little bit more depth than the book gives it. And then, do we ever really feel like insiders? What makes us feel like an insider? Is there, for me, there's always a part that is, am I really qualified to do this? Do I actually know enough to do this? Most of the time the answer is yes, but once in a while I put my foot in it and the answer is no. And so I'm not sure if you can really define someone as an insider. Even if you drink the Kool-Aid, even if you know it's where you want to be and it's a good fit, that insider-outsider definition I'm a little dubious about. And then in a sidebar in the book, there's a little section on organizational osmosis, which I thought was interesting. The idea is that the process of socialization, which is described in the larger part of the book as being based on these encounters where you don't fit the norms, or you do something different, or you say something wrong, and you have to kind of learn what's right and repair that. Perhaps in some situations, because we have so much information already, or because perhaps our job is the same regardless of what organization we're in, or, and again, not really mentioned in the book, but we have so much information available to us about the organization, perhaps that initial encounter phase is pretty seamless. The study that they mentioned stops there and says, there's no surprise and sense-making events. That's the terminology they use. A little weird. I think they probably still happen. They just happen further along. Certainly there are times when you're going along in your job and everything seems good, and then something in the system, because systems, changes. So you get a new manager, and that manager's the culture, the cultural assumptions they're bringing in are different than the cultural assumptions you have previously had as a group. Or something in the environment changes. Your company gets bought out, or there's a downturn in the industry. So this idea that, I've metamorphosized, I've osmosised, that's not really a word, it's all good, I totally fit it. Not really true. Obviously, things change. There's certainly a point at which we can feel comfortable and secure in the culture. We do feel like we belong. But that's not a static thing. Systems are constantly changing, and so are we. So onward. So to look a little bit more in depth at the socialization process, the book gives these different points as part of it. So developing familiarity with people, getting used to the culture, feeling recognized by others for what you get done, becoming more involved, getting better at your job, and then negotiating your role so that it fits. And there's some pretty good examples in the book about the idea of role negotiation. The boss is going to throw a bunch of different stuff at me, and then as she figures out what I'm good at, she's going to push me more in that direction. Or I'm going to say, yeah, maybe I'm good at that, but what I really want to do is this, and we negotiate till we find the spot that fits. One of the things that the book does not discuss is in this assimilation, integration, socialization process, how do we change the system? Because every new person who comes into the system, if you're looking at it from a systems perspective, is changing the system, minutely or otherwise. Even if it's just the energy they're bringing in, you know, or the attitude, if it's in an attitude of excitement or if it's lackadaisical, that changes the sort of biological information that's going around. The skills that they bring in change things. So this part of the book talks a lot about how we adapt to the organization, but not about how the organization adapts to us. And if you're looking at the organization as a system, of course it's going to adapt to us. It's a two-way process. But anyway, to get back to it, when I was reading this section, I thought about this list and a job where I sort of met all of these requirements and got through role negotiation and felt like I had acclimated to the organization. And that was at a larger company that I worked at. So I worked through this whole sort of familiarity, you know, making friends, getting used to the culture as much as I could, getting recognized for stuff that I was doing, getting more involved in perhaps the social life and the work of my specific group, getting super good at my job, expanding my job, and getting like a new job that I had written for myself. So that's a situation where I socialized successfully. So what the book doesn't talk about is what happens when you don't socialize successfully. So I had another job where none of it really happened. And I bet that most of you have had a position like that where, and this is an interesting little model because I can look at those things and go, yeah, I developed some familiarity. I made some friends at this company. It was a small, you know, web agency. So I made some friends, some people I'm still friendly with. There wasn't that much culture to acculturate to. It was a weird kind of flat environment. And everyone was kind of like huddled in their little corner protecting their fiefdom. So I don't know if that itself was a culture, but there definitely wasn't a feel-good thing going on. It definitely was not a family feeling. I really didn't feel recognized. There was a huge clash between me and my boss, who was not nearly as awesome as she thought she was. And I also felt horribly incompetent because I had been brought in for a higher level job than I was really ready for. And the difference between corporate design culture and agency design culture is like, whoa, so different. So I was just in over my head in every possible way. I also felt like my boss didn't get sort of down that scale with me of the leader-member exchange, so figure 7.1, like, she never really got involved in the role making. She just said, go off and do stuff. And I'm like, okay, what stuff? And then she'd say, oh, I'm protecting all this stuff over here. You go find something else to do. And so it was very odd. But in any case, there was a breakdown on both sides. There was a breakdown on my ability to do the work and state clearly what I needed, and there was a breakdown on the organizational side and the leadership side in figuring out how to utilize my skills the best. And so by the time I started to develop any kind of job competency, I was so demoralized that role negotiation didn't happen. What happened is I left. So I think that's an interesting thing to think about, because I think we sometimes learn more from those flame out situations than we do from the stuff that's just kind of like la 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 la, because we don't question things when they go really well. We question things when they go really, really bad. So it's important to think about both, but certainly those high stress situations are the ones we spend a lot of time going, why did that happen? How did I get into this situation? So something to chew on. Okay, so leader-member exchange theory is another concept that we talk about in the book. And I consider it kind of useful. It's an earlier 20th century model that's often touted in leadership theory. I find it a little narrow, like literally narrow, because it really is predicated on the idea that my entire success is based on how I negotiate my relationship and my role with my superior. So, a little mechanistic, yes. So I have a few questions about that. What what does this model leave out? So if we think about coming in as a new member to this organizational system, yes, how you relate to your superior and how you do your job and how you negotiate that together is important, but what else is going on in there? Well, for me, I think that my success is often based on how I build other relationships and how I find other resources. So I need relationships with people in other departments. I need relationships with other managers, with people up the chain. And so I think that from a systems perspective, leader-member exchange is a little bit narrow. Another thing to think about is if you remember the leadership grid, which is figure 3.2, which is talks about country club management and impoverished management styles. Leader-member exchange might work in the more extreme versions, but I don't think it really works in the middle. So if you're very mechanistic and everything is top down, then you can look at this theory and go, oh yeah, this is super interesting, and it works for me. It might work in a mechanized environment, but then again, in a highly mechanized environment where everything is spelled out, how much influence does your manager really have? Like, your manager might have some influence, but if everything you do is documented and is according to a rule book, then you may not actually have that much interaction. At the same time, in my position as a professor, which is sort of more country club, although I hate to say that because it's sort of got a negative connotation, but the reality is I work fairly independently, and I have people that I answer to and that I use for resources and for information, but it's not a constant daily sort of one-on-one experience. Again, the model kind of breaks down because my success is really based on how successful I am with the students and whether or not my manager can see that, and how actively I work towards expanding my abilities. And I don't get direct training from my manager. I get some from the school. I have resources available to me throughout the school, as students do, but it's up to me to sort of make the most of those and then show evidence that I've done it. So leader-member exchange is kind of a limited model to me, and you may see it again, especially when you study leadership. Okay, and then the last section is exit processes. And so some questions I wanted to throw out there was, how does our socialization level affect our exit process? So if I'm really, really part of an organization and I have a lot of friends, does my leaving kind of shake things up? Does it hurt the system? How does the system function? How do my friends and my colleagues and my boss and the people who report to me, how do they cope with my leaving? How do organizations generally deal with that? Unfortunately, the answer is they usually don't. Usually we're just kind of left to scramble around, whisper to each other about, oh my gosh, what happened? Did you hear about this? Most of the time, the stories that I hear about exit processes are pretty nightmarish, and mine have rarely been smooth, for sure. And so that also, how do we handle the exit of others? Like, is that something that, we talk about and we deal with? I mean, if somebody's leaving under good, they're leaving for a better position, or they're moving, or there's no kind of bad blood, then there's probably going to be like a party or a lunch or something where everybody, toasts them and says bon voyage, and that's probably a smoother exit process. But if someone is laid off, often there's very little communication at all. So think about examples of that, because it's something we may talk about in class next week. And then just to sort of add into that, some issues we'll be dealing with later, does organizational culture allow for the expression of feelings like loss, betrayal, or sadness, right? Anger, maybe some. Fear, almost never. And things like loss or sadness, those are really taboo emotions. They're hard emotions to deal with outside of the work world. And in the work world, it's kind of something that we just gloss over. But I certainly have felt loss and sadness with a sprinkling of betrayal, especially when someone that I really cared about left. When a boss, I had a manager who was just fantastic and really advocated for her employees and cared about what we did and, sort of walked the walk kind of person. And so when she got frustrated and left, it was a really difficult time for our group. So I think it's an interesting thing to talk about because it's such an undiscussable event. And so be thinking about some ideas because we may have a discussion of that in class next week. So that is it for the lecture on socialization processes. And I will talk to you next time.